Okay, so in light of this recent Charlie Kirk assassination, I'm going to discuss the paradox of tolerance. Okay, and I believe this paradox is very relevant right now, and here's why. Okay, the left and the right are knowingly or unknowingly using this paradox to justify their condemnation of the other team. Okay, so to dive deeper into that, the left wing is saying that Charlie Kirk deserves to be assassinated because he was intolerant. Okay, in other words, intolerant people should not be tolerated. Okay, and that's where the paradox comes into play from the left here. Because if you don't tolerate intolerance, then you are being intolerant yourself, right? So, on the other hand, the right wing is doing something very similar. The right wing is observing these left wingers, particularly radical left wingers, who are justifying this assassination or even gleefully celebrating it. And they are saying that the entire left wing holds these same values. In other words, they're saying that the entire left wing is celebrating this assassination. They are advocating for violence, right? Now, of course, this isn't true. Okay, obviously, this shooter acted either alone or coordinated with a few people, but it certainly wasn't the entire left in some giant group chat who coordinated this assassination, right? So, bottom line, both sides here, both sides of this political spectrum, are using this paradox of tolerance to justify their own intolerance fallaciously. So, what I want to get into in this video is a kind of a different perspective of this paradox of tolerance. And hopefully, I can kind of help you see how it can actually be resolved. Okay, so to use the paradox of tolerance to justify intolerance is not logical, okay? And that is because the original tolerant person who justifies their own intolerance of the original intolerant person fails to foresee the next person who will inevitably come along and justify intolerance against them. In other words, if you observe intolerance and you respond intolerantly, what is keeping somebody else from responding to your intolerance with more intolerance? Absolutely nothing, okay? This is why it's a paradox, okay? But then again, if there is an intolerant person in society, you can't just allow them to run free with their intolerance, okay? So you either tolerate the intolerant person and allow them to run around the world poisoning it with intolerance, or you replace that intolerant person with another intolerant person. So, in other words, no matter which way you go here, you have a vicious cycle of intolerance. So, what do we do? Okay? It seems like there's no way out. But it's actually quite simple, okay? What we have to do is we have to tolerate the intolerant person, but not their capacity for intolerance. Okay, now that might seem like it doesn't make sense. How can you possibly tolerate an intolerant person but not tolerate their capacity for intolerance? Well, first, you have to define what intolerance is, okay? And to do that, as a First Amendment supporter in the United States, I'll say this. You can say whatever you want. You can express disagreements with words, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. That is how good ideas defeat bad ideas. But what you can't do is use words to threaten violence or use violence, right? So the only intolerant behavior is violence and threats of violence. We have to peacefully strip away the intolerant person's ability to be violent. In other words, violent people simply rot in a prison cell. Again, we have to separate the capacity for violent intolerance from the intolerant person. And that person becomes tolerant. To make an intolerant act towards a person who has yet to express intolerance through violence is to be intolerant of a tolerant person. And to remain tolerant of the person who did express intolerance through violence is foolish and self destructive, right? So, it's really simple here, guys. All we have to do is condemn violence. We have to remove the violent person's ability to be violent. We have to take it from them, okay? And again, you do this peacefully. You arrest them, you put them in jail. Now, unfortunately, there is one caveat to that, and that is, of course, an active shooter or someone committing violence right now in real time. And what you have to do there is you may have to use lethal force, right? You have to defend yourself. You have to defend innocent people. By all means, exercise your right to self-defense. But beyond that, Charlie Kirk was a peaceful person. He was not violent. Therefore, by definition, he was a tolerant person. Now, it might piss some of you off for me to say that Charlie Kirk was tolerant, okay? But let's really dive into my definition of intolerance here. Why is it that I define intolerance strictly as violence or threats of violence? And why do I exclude peaceful ideologies, peaceful people from that definition of intolerant? So, to explain this, let's look at a different definition of intolerance, okay? Let's set mine aside for a minute. This definition is from Oxford Dictionary, okay? Intolerance is an unwillingness to accept views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from one's own. Now, at first glance, it might seem like, according to this definition, that Charlie Kirk is intolerant, okay? And of course, all of the evidence for this is found in the debates where he refuses to accept views, beliefs, or behavior that are not his own, right? But let's go a little deeper into this. And what I want you to do is ask yourself a question. What is the underlying emotion that enables you to feel threatened by an intolerant person? Well, I kind of hinted at it, right? I hinted at the threat. Threat implies fear, okay? So the answer is fear. Fear is a prerequisite for intolerance. If you have no fear, then you can have no ability or motivation to identify intolerance. There has to be some implied consequence in order for intolerance to exist. Okay, those consequences can only be delivered through the physical world, right? Violence. Without that physical threat, intolerance has no ammunition. So I'll explain this with an analogy here, okay? Imagine you're in a zoo, okay? And you go and check out the tigers. The tiger's hungry, okay? It's time to feed. And you are the food, okay? That tiger is therefore intolerant of you, okay? And you're probably intolerant of it. You are the tiger's lunch, but you've got a trick up your sleeve. You're in a zoo, after all, okay? Bottom line, there's a cage, okay? The tigers are in a cage. You are safe. So long as you stay out of that tiger's cage, you will completely disregard all of the tiger's intolerant feelings towards you. You walk through the zoo with perfect peace of mind. But, of course, the world isn't a zoo, right? The tigers of humanity, the violent humans, are walking around freely, okay? Or at least some of them, right? I mean, the world isn't a zoo. It's more like a jungle, and we are in the process of taming it. But there are still tigers out there. There were tigers before you or I or Charlie Kirk entered this world. In other words, what that means is that it was those violent people that predated Charlie Kirk and you and me who provided the original physical threat, okay, the original fear that enabled us to even fathom the idea of intolerance. Right? Charlie Kirk was literally one of the animals in the petting zoo. I mean, if you wanted to, you could have walked right up to Charlie at one of his university debates, shook his hand, and had a conversation. I mean, hell, if you offered, he might have accepted food from the nearby Pizza Hut. Okay? That's how peaceful this guy was. And he got killed by a tiger. Okay? So, how did Charlie Kirk come to be known as intolerant by so many people? Well, because he talked, okay? He talked a lot. He put himself on a pedestal in front of large groups of people, right? And On the other hand, who doesn't talk as much? Violent people, okay? Violent people sit on top of roofs and shoot people and then run away, all right? Peaceful people sometimes talk in front of large crowds, okay? Charlie pulled the short straw and paid the price for being born into a vicious cycle of jungle violence, right? And to be clear, of course he's not the only victim to this jungle violence, all right? I mean, there was a school shooting on the same day that Charlie Kirk was murdered. And as of now, I don't actually think anyone died in that school shooting except the shooter, which is good, right? There are, I think, some children in critical condition, though. So we can sit here and point fingers at peaceful people, or we can focus on putting the tigers in cages so that we can remove the actual source of fear in the world that fuels the intolerance. And what's really important to understand here is that the biggest violent perpetrators on this planet are governments, okay? And we elect those governments. So what this means is that if you are a repeat Democrat or Republican voter, you are complacent to the forever foreign wars, right? What is happening here in this jungle that we all live in is that all of the herbivores are fighting each other, while the carnivores run circles around us and corral us as they please, okay? It's called a divide and conquer strategy. I implore you to learn about the nature of divide and conquer strategies, okay? They're pretty simple, okay? You split one united group of people into two groups, and then you manipulate them into blaming each other for the problems caused by the tiger. So again, when you cage the tigers, when you imprison the violent people, the fear manifested by the threat of physical violence goes away. Okay? Without the fear, the human psyche literally has no ability to identify intolerance. So let's go back to that definition of intolerance that I found in the Oxford Dictionary. Okay? It says that intolerance is an unwillingness to accept views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from one's own. So in this definition, there is one particular word that defines the line between tolerance and intolerance, okay? That word is a verb. Verbs imply action, and you need an implied action in order to define intolerance. So that word is accept, okay? Accept is a verb. We have to really think about what it means to accept or not accept views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from your own. So if your favorite food is pizza and my favorite food is sushi, if I don't accept pizza as my favorite food, you wouldn't say that I'm not accepting your views, beliefs, or behavior, because I'm not going so far as to restrict your ability to eat pizza. And if I were to restrict your ability to eat pizza, I would essentially have to threaten violence against anyone that started mixing flour and water together, right? I'd have to regulate with threat of force anyone who has pizza ingredients in their home, okay? And if I didn't threaten you with violence, you'd have no reason to stop eating pizza, just as you have no reason to worry about the tiger in the cage. So acceptance is nonviolence, all right? And by extension, according to this definition, intolerance is an unwillingness to remain nonviolent with those who express views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from your own. Put another way, intolerance is a willingness to commit violence against anyone who expresses views, beliefs, or behavior that differ from your own. So when you agree to disagree with somebody, you are expressing tolerance, okay? Not intolerance. And that's how every Charlie Kirk debate went, frankly. And what this hopefully sets you up to do in the future is to have another conversation, have another debate. And maybe one of you has refined your arguments enough, or maybe there's new evidence to support your argument that will help you win over your opposition, right? Now, all of this being said, okay, after all of the defending I have done of Charlie Kirk so far in this video, I have to say that I'm not a fan of Charlie Kirk, okay? I never was. Occasionally, I would listen to one of his monologues or debates, and within about 30 seconds, I would find some logical fallacy and click away, right? His arguments were just not that persuasive to me. And in fact, in the beginning of this video, I pointed out a tendency of some people on the right to generalize all left-wing ideologies as violent due to the actions of a few violent radical left-wingers. Charlie Kirk himself has made some of those same generalizations. Okay, so I disagree with many of his views, beliefs, and behaviors, but disagreement is not intolerance. When disagreement becomes so radical that it results in violence, then and only then is intolerance expressed by that violence, right? And there is one behavior that Charlie practiced that I do support, okay, that I do agree with, okay? That behavior is nonviolence, right? Again, Charlie Kirk was peaceful. He was the goat in the petting zoo that could be trusted with children, okay? So if you have to use violence to spread your ideologies, you need to go back to the drawing board, okay? If you use violence to spread your ideology, then your primary ideology becomes violence, okay? Not whatever it was before. So just because one person with a left or right-wing ideology resorts to violence, it doesn't mean that the entire left or right-wing ideology becomes tainted or spoiled by that violence. We can't pin the crimes of one violent person on a bunch of peaceful people just because they voted for the same political party. And beyond that, if we do make these generalizations and we blame an entire left-wing or right-wing ideology because of one radical left or right-winger, then we open ourselves up to be controlled by a third party. And what I'm referring to is some type of false flag operation. So you could have someone like a corrupt government or government agency, foreign or domestic, commit political violence in order to create division within a nation or division between two political parties. And of course, that division is a lot easier to create if you have the media on your side, right? If you have the media who are helping you spread that divisive narrative. So this is why we have to be really careful when we jump to these generalizations that, frankly, we often see in mainstream media. So just be careful, bottom line. Now, I've done what I can to condemn violence in this video, okay? And to kind of wrap this up, I'm going to leave you with one more bit of context in regards to that violence. So, the United States government is not exactly a beacon of peace, okay? Our government has been at war for 93% of its existence as a nation, or as a government. There are other nations that we have turned into hell, okay? But if you walk around the average city here, you're probably not going to see that hell, okay? Most people that live in America live a peaceful life and die of old age. Now, sure, there are some violent places here and there, but it certainly isn't the hell that we have created in Syria or Gaza, for example. In other words, the walls of my house are so thick I hear nothing at all. That's a quote from Rise Against. The average American is very separated from the damage done by our military. But the calls are starting to come from inside the house. The chickens are coming home to roost, okay? If you vote and pay taxes to a government that has been at war for 93% of its existence, only to condemn one small subset of that violence that happened to come home and roost on your particular doorstep, and that doorstep can be literal or metaphorical, then you're not being consistent with your criticism, okay? If you turn your head and ignore the violence that you fund outside of your country, you promote violence inside of your country. This is a call to action. for every American who has repeatedly voted for violent Democrat and Republican regimes to rid themselves of this hypocrisy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't get lucky and elect some peaceful Democrat and Republican politicians who stop these forever wars. But one thing's for certain: we have failed thus far to do that. So we have to look at what we've done and accept the fact that something is wrong about it. And right now, Democrats and Republicans are blaming each other for the violence within our borders. But it is Democrat and Republican politicians who are providing an example outside of our borders that violence is okay. The violence is a solution to the fear that we feel. But when you commit violence, you instill the very same fear that you felt inside your opposition or your opposition's family or political party. There's a quote, okay? It says that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist, right? I don't like the quote, okay? I don't agree with it. The devil doesn't play tricks. The devil is a metaphor for a fearful mindset that fails to understand the mutual fear that we all feel, okay? An individual in this devilish mindset may therefore fail to find solutions that resolve their own fears without directly or indirectly creating more fear in others, okay? In other words, actions that come from this devilish mindset are not actually solutions at all, okay? To use violence to solve problems is to take one step forward and one step back, okay? At best. Violence relieves one person's fears at the expense of another's, okay? And then that fear cycles back through humanity, all right? So when you use violence to relieve your fears, it's only temporary. These vicious cycles are not limited to within the borders of one nation or within one political party. Humanity is connected, okay? The world is globalized. This means that our economies affect each other. This means that when there's a supply chain disruption in Russia or in China, it's going to affect the United States and vice versa. So what we have to do as a nation, as a species, is a little bit of soul searching. We have to reflect a little bit, a little introspection. We have to think about why it is that we feel fear. What is it that makes a human fearful? Well, obviously, other people can make other humans fearful. That interspecies violence can bring fear. But what originally caused that interspecies violence? The answer is simple and quite intuitive with a little bit of introspection. Scarcity causes fear, okay? Scarcity of necessities, namely food, water, shelter, clothing, things like that, right? Humanity has historically not had stable and adequate access to these necessities. So when one tribe was starving and the neighboring tribe only had enough food for themselves, the only option for the hungry tribe to survive was violence. And the only option for the tribe with the food was violent self-defense, okay? In other words, both tribes were defending themselves with violence from scarcity. Not from each other, but from scarcity, okay? Scarcity is the original source of the fear. But look around, okay? Read the room. Look at the abundance we have today. Look at humanity's cumulative technology that has enabled that abundance. When a drought comes along today, we don't need to kill our neighbor and steal their food because someone 1,000 miles away on the other side of the world got a little extra rain that year, which led to a surplus of food, which we can then share, right? We have the capacity to resolve the scarcity. But unfortunately, our economic structures manufacture scarcity artificially because we fear violence. In other words, the billionaire who manipulates the economy and exploits labor and collects all this excess money to build bunkers and to hire bodyguards is only doing so because they're afraid of violence, okay? We have to become conscious of the mutual fear that we all feel, okay, that led to that original interspecies violence that still plagues us today. So that's it for this video, okay? Next video, I'm going to dive deeper into this idea of scarcity through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, okay? I'm going to add a little nuance to what I said in this video, and I'll finish with this. Charlie Kirk, I don't know where he's at right now. Is he in heaven? Is he in hell? Is he dead? Is he resting in peace? I don't know what happens after we die, okay? I'm not that guy. But what I do know is that we need peace just as much as Charlie Kirk does. So let's not limit peace to the dead, okay? Let's bring it to the living so we can make this world heaven on earth. Thanks for watching.